All right, welcome in. Late Kick is live. It is Sunday night. It is June 7th now, the year of our Lord 2020. Still closer to college football season. Still a long way to go, relatively speaking, at least to college football season. And by the end of the show tonight, we're going to give you a little update. Where do we stand? What's our thinking? How Fuller Stadium is going to be? Are we going to start on time? You know, things of that nature. I've also got to talk to you about some things that happened while I was on vacation. I came back, I did a little cursory glance of essentially what you guys have been talking about. I saw some fiery responses to something that our Bud Elliott put out about Texas A&M, which I thought included some pretty valid, not even necessarily questions, just points. And they're points that kind of coincide with what we've talked about in regards to A&M on this show for quite a while now, all the way dating back to last year before we were even doing this show at 24/7 Sports. We'll discuss that. We'll also discuss a viewer question that we had on Twitter that I really didn't feel like waiting until the Late Kick Extra podcast to hit, because I thought it was about time for us to talk about it anyway. So we're going to hit that. It has to do with Auburn. We're also going to talk about, and this is probably going to be something that we're going to do for the next several weeks, just some of the most important people, not necessarily players, coaches, administrators, but all of the above. Most important figures in college football this year. And I'm going to give you the name and then a brief reason why. And we're going to kind of kick that off tonight with Sam Howell of North Carolina. A big name if you're a college football fan, a huge name if you're a Tar Heel fan, but I don't think a name that's garnered a lot of national attention. You know, if you're just a casual observer that lives in Amarillo, Texas, I don't think you've really worried all that much about Sam Howell. Maybe that changes this year. But first things first, speaking of the Lone Star State, let's go to Texas, specifically Texas A&M. Now, I want to take you back to last year. I saw A&M in person several times from field level last year. I saw him at Clemson, which was about 115 degrees. I think that was like week 2 or week 3. I saw him later in the year at home against Alabama. I saw him even later in the year in a very ugly day in multiple ways, but I'm speaking specifically meteorologically. It was just a sloppy day in Athens when they played Georgia. And it just struck me last year. I talked about this during the season last year, how hard it seemed for them to move the ball. Just offensively, everything that went right for them, every first down, it felt like a struggle. And you watched some of the better offenses and more prolific offenses in the SEC in the country, and it just seemed like every now and then, you know, a couple times per drive, per successful drive, they're just an easy first down. I mean, there's just an easy 10 or 15 yards to pick up. I know it's not easy, but they make it look easy. A&M doesn't have that. Texas A&M in the big games, they didn't have that. So I go on vacation, and I see that Bud Elliott put out something that it's pretty glaring, to be honest with you. So let's frame this the right way. Because I remember last year standing on the field against Clemson or against Alabama or against Georgia, and you looked at the end of the game, and the margins, aside from the Bama game maybe, the margins weren't terrible. They weren't being defeated by 4 touchdowns. So if you just look at the box scores or you look at the final scores, it doesn't scream A&M got the floor wiped with them. That's not what it screams, but yet when you're watching in real time, you're saying, it doesn't really feel like they have a good shot to win this. So I remember thinking that at the time. So there's optimism in 2020. A lot of optimism. Some people even going as far as to say, that team, hey, lean in close, let me whisper, dark horse. Yeah, dark horse in the SEC West. From what I can tell, most of it has to do with returning a quarterback in Kellen Mond in a year where there aren't a ton of returning quarterbacks in the SEC. More on that in a second. You got Kellen Mond back, but really what I think it comes down to is you guys got done wrong with your schedule last year. It was already hard enough. Not only do they play in the SEC West and they had to cross-division their way over to Georgia, they also picked up Clemson in the non-conference rotation. So it was tough, borderline impossible to navigate that last year, winning 9 games or more. And they didn't. They were not a bad team last year, but they were a far cry from the elite team. So the optimism this year has a lot to do, to be quite frank with you, with schedule. Whereas last year you talked about them having one of the toughest. This year, it's not the easiest one in the country, but they do drop Clemson. They do drop Georgia from the cross division. And you look at it right now and you ask yourself, who do I think would be ranked top 20? There's only one team that I feel comfortable saying they'll face before the last 2 weeks of the season, which we'll get to in a second, that would be ranked top 20, and that's Auburn, and I think that's the second or third week of October. They go to Auburn. They got a back-to-back road stretch of at Auburn, at South Carolina. Not easy, but I think schedule has a lot to do with this, and you're just another year into Jimbo Fisher. So there's a lot of optimism. I'm not here to rain on that optimism. I call them, and have called them, the most interesting team for me in college football this year for that reason. The potential is there. I mean, the investment's there, the passion's there, everything's there. We've talked about this before with A&M. Everything's there to win. But there are major question marks here. Major offensive question marks. Before you talk about defense, you talk about all that, I'm talking about the specialty of the man who runs this program, and that's Jimbo Fisher. Offense. And there are major question marks there. So now I want to get into this. I saw you guys, some of you kind of jumped on old Bud Elliott, and listen, he doesn't need any help fighting for himself and defending himself, but I texted him today and said I was going to defend him a little bit anyway. So he put out a piece a couple of days ago. This has gotten a lot of traction. A lot of you claimed that it was a hit piece. I don't know how with this much data in it and this few opinions in it. And then a lot of you asked, oh, is this a troll job? I don't really think so. Not everything that invites you to click on it is a troll job, guys. So with that in mind, talking about A&M last year, this is Bud Elliott talking now. Looking at games against Clemson, Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, and LSU reveal a troubling pattern. Texas A&M is an offense that relies on the short pass to move football and control the game. It's designed to have an answer to any defense. However, it also does not create a lot of free runners or wide open receivers. Thus, to create explosive plays, reads must be made quickly, passes complete, and in stride. If they're not, it leads to a lack of explosiveness, which was an issue throughout 2019. Now, this is no shocking revelation. This is something that any Texas A&M Aggie fan I talked to last year recognized readily. Jimbo Fisher recognized this. But now we move forward because we're asking, how much has changed? Like, why all this optimism in 2020? Bud continues. The elite defenses did not fear explosive passes from the Aggies. They were able to squat on short throws. Okay, again, now we move into the second point here. When you talk about closing that gap, everyone wants to know, have we closed the gap? Well, we're another year in. We got experience at quarterback. Schedule turns our way. When I mentioned those last two games of the year, they are at Alabama, home versus LSU. Those are A&M's last two games of the year. So now let's talk about the stark difference between meaningful time and garbage time last year. First off, the Clemson game. A&M, 129 yards on 43 plays. That's 3 yards per play. But once Clemson started to allow short passes and protecting its lead, A&M, 160 yards on 26 plays. So garbage time, they run up a 6.2 yards per play average. It continues against Auburn. Auburn jumped out to a 21-3 lead. Then A&M, in that point, racks up 156 yards on 42 plays. That's good for 3.7 a pop. Then they scored 17 points over the final 3 drives. 235 yards on 28 plays. That's 8.4 per click. Again, not necessarily garbage time because the game was competitive, but the dynamics of the game had changed. We continue against Alabama, a game I was at. Alabama's up 47-20. They call off the dogs a little bit. Up to that point, A&M, 279 yards on 56 plays. That's 5 yards per. And after that, 110 yards on 14 plays, about 8 yards per. Against Georgia, this one was ugly for both teams offensively. Georgia builds a 19-6 lead. A&M, 46 plays, 152 yards, 3.3 yards per play. After Georgia backs off a little bit, A&M, 122 yards, 16 plays, 7 yards per play. So what are we saying here? Because this kind of happens to a lot of teams. But what are we saying here? Because it continues against LSU. A&M, 26 plays for 24 yards until LSU gets a 31-0 lead, and then after that, you get the drill here. I don't need to continue reading off numbers to you. But what are we saying here? So I looked at your reactions. Some of you thought, hey, he's making some good points. Others said, well, this is kind of a hit job, or this is just being critical of mine. Listen, you got to bring counterpoints, database, logic-based counterpoints, because the best I could tell, this in an analytical sort of way, backed up what anecdotally my eyes saw all last year and what makes this team the most interesting in the country this year, because they've got a good enough roster. Obviously, they've got, we think, the right coach. They've got experience at quarterback. My question has not been so much personnel issue with them. Is what Jimbo Fisher does from a systematic standpoint, is what he does best fit and most tailored to run a major program. They can out-athlete some folks. They can bring in athletes to make plays there. It doesn't necessarily have to be an NFL approach of every yard, every inch we gain, we have to scheme guys open. It's kind of what it felt like at times last year. So then I ask, what changes are made? And then we continue. A lot of you, when I was presenting, I know a few A&M folks, so I presented this to them. I always present, the points that I'm going to make on the show to my buddies just to get a general gauge of a reaction I'm going to get. And a lot of them said, well, I think a better run game this year will help us a lot with play action and, attracting more attention to the backfield. And that makes sense. So then I'm reading the rest of Elliott's piece here, and there it is. One key might be a better run game, could make play action more effective, but A&M already had a very effective run game, rating 9th in the S&P Plus rushing offense last year. The answer is the passing game. He's dead on the money accurate. The answer is not just the passing game, but in particular, explosive plays and making someone see balance offensively truly is not statistical. Balance is making someone believe that you're capable of running it or throwing it effectively on any down. And to maximize that effectiveness, they got to believe that you're capable of stretching the field vertically against them. No one in their right mind believed that against A&M last year. So why are they the most interesting? Well, this year, we fast forward and you could be 10-0. For all A&M fans care, you could be 10-0 going into those last 2 weeks. If they find out, if you go into Alabama and you get drugged 47-21, and then you get drugged 45-17 against LSU, I know good and well what they'll say. You'll have a 10-win season on your hands, and you'll say, but really, what changed? All that changed is our schedule was more workable, because really the product on the field is comparable to what we saw last year. And I can't hypothetically just play out the season, but if that were to happen, and that's the end result, I don't know that I'd blame you. But here's what also could happen. What also could happen, a lot of people believe in momentum to varying degrees. Of course, it exists. How important it is week to week, we can determine and debate later. But what happens if, unlike last year, when you had a rocky start to the season, all of a sudden, you do build a little more confidence, a little momentum, and most importantly, you find the pieces of your offense and the facets of that offense that need to gel, and they do gel, and the product that you're able to bring into Tuscaloosa in week 11 or 12 or whatever it is, and then home against LSU the next week, maybe it does look a far cry different. Maybe Jimbo Fisher does a healthy inventory of his offense in the offseason, and he says, we got a roster good enough. I mean, we may not go receiver for receiver with LSU or Alabama, but we're good enough. Our O-line, our running back talent, it's been good enough. At quarterback, we're good enough. I have to take it upon myself to make some adjustments here. Because the bottom line, last year, for instance, or this year maybe even, you may look at A&M's offensive line and say, well, they didn't give Kellen Mond really much of a chance. Well, listen. I'm not debating that. But if you saw that and I saw that, guess who else needs to see that? Now, the feeling I got last year at times is Jimbo Fisher, I know he's got a play sheet in his hand, but figuratively, it felt like that Clemson game, most notably, it just felt like he kind of throw the hands up, like, what else can I do? There is no extra sheet on this play card I have. There is no extra chapter in the playbook. If I'm speaking for him, felt like at times last year he thought, I'm kind of doing everything I could do. I've kind of called everything I could do here. We're just kind of at an impasse. So maybe that was last year. If there's no adjustment this year, I don't know that I should expect or you should expect this quantum leap, which begs the question, what is the adjustment? And that's about all we can say in June for Texas A&M, or really any team thus far. Let's move forward here. I had a Twitter question. I told you I had a Twitter question, and a lot of times I, including every show, encourage you, if I don't get your stuff answered on the show, I'm going to answer it. It'll be in the Late Kick Extra podcast. We record it Tuesdays. We release it Wednesdays. You guys have done an excellent job giving that a lot of traction. If you haven't already, leave us a 5-star review there, and you can leave in the review section a comment in the form of a question, and that really gets traction too in our eyes and gets you answered. But I do also leave the Twitter direct message feature open for everybody, even those of you who don't follow me, for just such an occasion. So I am opening it today, and David reached out with this question. I want to know about Auburn's offense next year. Now, Gus Malzahn has stated he's turning over the keys to Chad Morris. Chad Morris, former head coach, of course, at Arkansas. Before that, he was at, where in the world was he at? He's somewhere in Texas. And then he was the offensive coordinator, most notably at Clemson before that. SMU, yeah, that's right. So David asks, I had a question. Malzahn said he's going to turn over the keys to Chad Morris. Now, we also know that Gus has an ego. David's words, not mine. And like him or not, He put his team in a position to win every single game this past season. Execution was a problem, that's on him, but from a play calling standpoint, he put his team in positions to win with the help of Kevin Steele. Do you see any potential problems between Malzahn and Chad Morris's offensive philosophies? If so, what might they be? This is an interesting question. This is the question at the forefront of pretty much every Auburn fan's mind right now. So it's important to remember what David said here and to go back to the why. A lot of times when you have a new coordinator, a new offensive coordinator brought in, it's because the previous year was either disastrous or it was so good that the previous year's offensive coordinator got a big job elsewhere. That's not really the case here. Neither of those are the case at Auburn this year. What happened is Malzahn was the guy last year. He took it upon himself, remember, to reassume play calling duties. And so they had an offensive coordinator last year, but not one in the classical sense of a play-to-play caller like you would maybe at Alabama with Steve Sarkisian. So last year was not a terrible year for Auburn. They had one of those A&M South Carolina kind of schedules, and they lose close to Florida, double-digit win team, New Year's 6 team. They lose by 3 points on the road to eventual national champion LSU. They lost close to Georgia. They beat Alabama. This was a team that was close against a lot of very good teams. They didn't go 4-8. They didn't go 7-5. They had a pretty good year. But then what happened at the end of the season is Chad Morris became available. And Gus Malzahn has immense respect, as do most coaches at the high school and college level, for Chad Morris. So it wasn't a necessity that they made the move here. It was more a move born out of opportunity. And the reason that I state this, you'll know in just a second. So preseason sentiment here is going to be meaningless because David is right again. You're going to listen to Gus Malzahn, and you're probably going to hear him say some variation of the following sentence. It's Chad Morris's offense this year, or Chad Morris, he's running things this year. All right, well, he could mean every single word of that, and that still be meaningless for me, and here's why. I was thinking earlier today about an appropriate road-based metaphor, so here's the one I came up with. Do you remember when you were younger, you probably took trips with your mom or your dad, and you wanted to drive. Every kid wants to drive, and so eventually you find yourself old enough, probably 8, 9, 10 years old, that being old enough, at least where I come from, and then you get out on a rural 2 or 4 lane road, and there's no traffic, and it's a straight shot, and so you get pulled over into the lap, and they say, it's your turn to drive. Mind you, your feet aren't long enough to reach the pedals yet, but your hands can reach the steering wheel, and your hands take hold of the wheel, and no one else's hands are on the wheel, and you're driving. And as long as the car's going straight, you're in control. But once that car starts to drift towards the center just a little bit, or if it even so much as starts to act like it's going to drift towards the white line on the side, what happens? That hand reaches in from the left or the right, sort of guides you back on path. That, if I had to guess, will be the offensive system at Auburn this year. I don't doubt for a second that what Gus Malzahn is saying is true. I don't doubt that he has full intention of letting Chad Morris do his thing. And I don't doubt if Auburn is running folks out of buildings and Auburn is running up an undefeated record late into the year and there's just smooth sailing, I don't doubt that it is Chad Morris's offense. That's not reality. That's not how college football works, especially when you play the kind of schedule that Auburn plays. So what happens, not when things are good, what happens when a guy who himself had a pretty good year last year and was quoted as saying, I never should have relinquished play calling duties. I'm calling plays at Auburn from now on. What happens when he's looking there and saying, oh no, I don't like where we are. 2 minutes to go into half. I got some thinking to do when I go into the locker room. When we come out here for the third quarter, I'm not so sure I don't need to have some input here. So Malzahn does not see himself, I can tell you right now, as a CEO. Malzahn sees himself as a play caller. He's a quarterback on the sideline. He is a second pair of eyes for his quarterback, and that quarterback, the one he has been pretty emphatic in saying he's going to win a national championship with in Bo Nix, he recruited him. He's developing. So now we get to look forward a little bit. Perception versus reality. What's it actually going to be like? Well, play calling is not like it seems on Xbox. You know, on Xbox, at least when they used to put the game out, play calling would be you pick a play and you run the play and then the play's over and okay, let me scroll through this list of plays and let me pick what I'm going to do next. And if you're a novice player like most people are, there's not really a whole lot of design. You keep going with what ends up working, and you don't go so much with the stuff that's not working, and you just avoid altogether the plays that look weird and you don't know how to run them. Well, in football, there's a whole lot more design. It's a lot more chess-based in that you're trying to think several moves ahead, and you have points, and you have counters, and you have moves and counter moves. And so, you got about a 2 or 3 set list of here's scenario A, they go this way, we're going this way. If they go that way, we're going to go that way. And you sort of reassess at various points throughout the game. And the point is, you may have a thick playbook that looks like a phone book. You got a list of anywhere from about 60 to 120 plays that are in your game plan for that specific day. And guess who signed off on every one of them, regardless of who's calling plays? The head man has signed off on every single one of them, and you've filtered out what works in practice and doesn't work in practice. And that guy that you're looking at right here, if you're watching on YouTube, Gus Malzahn, no matter who's calling plays, he signed off on it. So what will it probably look like? Malzahn's going to be involved. You'll probably not know it unless you're privy to the headset, and to my knowledge, no one else is. You may not know it necessarily, but there are different ways here. There are different ways in the flow of a game for both guys to be involved in the play calling process. A lot of staffs do it this way. One guy is responsible for certain down and distance. Another guy is responsible, and it is his specialty, for third and short. One guy handles red zone or red area, whatever you want to call it. Maybe one guy has more the 20 to 20 kind of frame. Third down and fourth or less. Third down and 6 or more. You may have on any given Saturday, that being in Malzahn's wheelhouse, and he's got it when that kind of situation develops. The point is, there are 1,000,001 different ways that this could unfold. But no, David, in a roundabout way, to answer your question, I don't believe the keys are solely in the hands of anyone at Auburn when it comes to offense. So, having said all that, the next question that we're not necessarily going to answer tonight is losing what you lose on the offensive line and needing the leap in production that you need from the quarterback position this year. Do you get those things taken care of? Because I don't really know any offense that's going to do a whole heck of a lot as it comes to contending for an SEC championship if you don't get improved play from a guy that I think's capable of being a star. Bo Nix got the physical attributes, certainly didn't put up the production on a consistent basis last year. You got to develop there. Chad Morris is known for being able to develop that position, but like we were just talking about a few minutes ago with A&M, what kind of shot did Kellen Mond have last year? Development or not? What kind of shot did he have behind that offensive line? And then we fast forward to this year with Auburn. Will we be asking the same question? I mean, when they go into big games, is the first 2 or 3 sentence summary or preview, rather, for every Auburn game, if Auburn's offensive line can hold together, then ellipses. That's not necessarily a place you want to be, so time will tell there. We are doing something that's kind of starting tonight. It's sort of a concept. I don't do many lists on here, at least. I don't do a whole lot of countdowns, but I did kind of catch some inspiration the other day when we were talking about Josh Gaddis, the offensive coordinator at Michigan. I'm going to circle back to him and probably cover him extensively in this feature before too much longer, but I was thinking about just different figures. Some are players, some are coordinators, some are strength coaches, some may be athletic directors, but the most important figures in the college football world any given year. It's not always just a list of the Heisman candidates and the most elite head coaches. So tonight we're going to talk about Sam Howell a little bit, and that's the concept. How about the hype here? The hype around North Carolina. It's 2 or 3-fold. If you're a diehard college football fan, there's hype because, well, you saw how close they came against Clemson last year. You have felt the undercurrent, sort of the groundswell of momentum around this program. You see what they're doing in recruiting. And unlike some teams that have already peaked, North Carolina's doing it with in-state guys. And so it stands to reason they've probably got a lot more staying power with this recruiting class. And that guy, Sam Howell, that's the other kicker. Sam Howell is a guy who is poised to burst onto the national scene this year. He's not a national name yet. He's a guy a lot of college football fans know. But like I said, casual fan from Tulsa, Oklahoma, I don't think that they are really aware of Sam Howell like they are Trevor Lawrence or like they would be Justin Fields. So he's a guy who has the skill set to insert his name into that conversation. I was reading some stuff over with our buddies at Inside Carolina. Grant Hughes had put together sort of a collection of different takes on Carolina, different takes on Sam Howell, and then his own spin. And he put together some really good numbers himself about what that guy's already accomplished. Do you realize he's already 6th all time at North Carolina in passing touchdowns? He was a true freshman last year. That's the only year he's ever played there. He's already in the top 10 in a lot of offensive statistical categories for a career. Pro Football Focus, 2nd most valuable season from a true freshman since they've kept that stat. Number 1 is a guy you've probably heard of in the same region. His name is Trevor Lawrence. He still plays football for the Clemson Tigers. Now here is what has everyone excited. What I just mentioned, to go along with the fact that North Carolina returns 93% of last year's rushing yards and receiving yards. Now consider, we're talking impact, the most impactful people, the most important people in college football this year. Consider the impact that this guy could have on a multitude of different fronts. It's obvious what he could do for Carolina, but consider sort of the ramifications for other teams. Some are on Carolina's schedule, some maybe not. They start the season at Central Florida. I saw Five Dimes, I believe, release some lines on that the other day. Maybe a 3-point dog, short dog, North Carolina on the road to start the year. Interesting. You guys have complained about not enough folks going into Central Florida to play them. Well, Carolina does this year. They open the season at Central Florida. Now, you and I both know that's a chance to knock one of the perennial G5 playoff contending teams, at least being in the conversation, off in week 1. So there's that opportunity. But this game also matters a lot for Carolina. I'm going to circle back to that in a second. You know who they play in week 2? They go back on the road, kinda. They go to a neutral site. They play Auburn in Atlanta, speak of the Tigers. So that's week 2. And do you understand what happens in Auburn circles if that offense sputters in week 2 in Atlanta against a non-conference opponent and they don't have that offensive line in gear? And all of the losses that Auburn has started to suffer defensively, they're exploited by one of, as it turns out, the best quarterbacks in America. It could impact Auburn, but now I want you to think about this for a second. After that, it's not that they play high school teams, but they've got a classical ACC schedule. Every game's manageable. They should be favored in a vast majority of those games. They don't play Clemson in the regular season. But it stands to reason, if they make it through all that, Clemson will be waiting there for them in the ACC championship game. So look at what bookends their schedule. Let's just hypothetically for a second, let's paint a path where they make it to the conference championship game. You have played a schedule here that includes Central Florida, a very reputable G5 opponent, probably the most high profile that you could play, and you went on the road to play them. If you've won that game, especially if you've won that one and you've beaten Auburn, one of the SEC big boys in week 2, and by the way, you took it upon yourself to schedule both of these out-of-conference games, and you've got Clemson at the end of the year. Do you understand we're talking about paths, realistic paths, for Mack Brown's North Carolina Tar Heels to be a college football playoff contender? A lot of time between now and the beginning of the season, obviously. A lot of time between now and then. They have a path to be a player here. Now, the path's obvious if they go undefeated. Obviously, they're in. What in the world's happened to Clemson at that point would be my question. But let's paint a different path. I want to ask you something for a second. Think about how absurd it would sound on the surface if I said, hey, I think 2 ACC teams could make the playoff this year. How absurd does that sound? Well, think it through. Now, this takes some help from outside the conference, but think it through. Let's say the path I just painted up to the ACC championship game happens. Carolina didn't schedule down. They didn't put Wofford on the schedule. They didn't open up against Norfolk State. They went to Central Florida. They played Auburn at a neutral site and beat them both. Let's just say they beat them both. And run the table and beat everyone else they're asked to beat, and then they fall competitively to number 1 or number 2 Clemson in the ACC championship game. You're sitting there, ironically, having not played the Clemson Tigers in the regular season and may not have faced but one ranked opponent on your entire conference schedule. But because you have the combination of a very impressive loss in a conference championship setting against a playoff team, 2 very impressive wins against top 20 caliber out-of-conference competition, and maybe you have a mess in other conferences to where there are not 3 other slam dunk candidates for the playoff. Maybe it's a Big Ten, Clemson, and SEC, and then just a jumbled mess of 1 and 2 loss teams from elsewhere. That could be the second path for them getting in there. And I'm going to just tell you right now, this is not a prediction show, especially tonight in June, but I'm telling you right now, a lot crazier things have happened than that scenario. Everyone thinks right now, and I believe this. Now, I believe Penn State, I said this a couple of weeks ago, Penn State is the most likely non-conference champion to make the playoff this year, to me, because of how the Big Ten sets up. But North Carolina is also in a position, albeit over in the corner, in a dimly lit corner at that, to sit there and have two very quality non-conference wins, a competitive loss in a conference championship game on their resume, and if you got three more undefeateds, then it's a moot point. But if you enter a situation where we got three slam dunks and then that fourth spot, hey, let's just juggle these balls and see which one we have in our hand when the music stops, it could be one that's painted that beautiful light hue of Carolina blue. Just something to think about. Sam Howell is very important this year. I know Mac Brown is. Sam Howell is very important this year because you also got to understand if either of those scenarios realistically were to unfold, it means he's had a monster season, which also means for those of you who care about the Heisman Trophy, not my cup of tea necessarily, he's in New York City for the Heisman Trophy ceremony as well. A Carolina quarterback. Been a little while since we talked about this program like that. Good to have him back. Let's go Q&A before we wrap it up here. Charles on Twitter asked, do you still think college football will start on schedule? More so than ever, Charles, yes, I do. I think that you could probably say we reached a critical point about 2 weeks ago, week or two ago, where if you were to take a random poll, or an anonymous poll, because no one likes to go on the record, an anonymous poll of P5 power brokers, let's just say for lack of a better term, I think that critical mass tilted towards the positive side, at least as it pertains to us and what we want to see happen. And I think now a lot of people not only believe we're going to be able to start on time at most places in the country, I think the bigger question a lot of these administrators are asking is, well, we continue to see states open up, and we aren't getting disaster stories out of there, so I wonder how many people we'll be able to have in stands. Charles, that's the conversation that a lot of people, when I talk to them, that's the conversation they're having. It's not, well, we're terrified as to whether we're even going to get a football season in. It's, oh, we're going to get the season in. It's, what's it going to look like and how normal can we make it? And I'll tell you another thing. I had to go back and see which show it was. It was 1 month ago. It was the Sunday show of this week, 1 month ago. And I read to you a lot of headlines, and I read to you a lot of the doomsday scenarios that were being presented out there, and we refused to take that stance here for obvious reason. Even if I believed it, I wouldn't have taken that stance. There was no point in making that kind of statement in May, and hey, there's no point in making it in June either. And you'll be hard-pressed to nail me to the wall in July on it. But I said at the time was on our side, and it still is. You still got a long way to go. Remember, I read you how many days were between us at that point and even conference media days, much less the opening of any kind of camp. And so now here we sit. We are in the first week or two, depending on when you're watching this, of June, and already it feels like the tide is sort of tilted. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have something incredibly negative pop up 3 weeks from now that makes us look back at this June show, this June 7th show, and say, boy, remember how optimistic we were June 7th, and now not so much. Yeah, everything's still on the table. As I told you, the first time I ever heard the word coronavirus, an expert on coronavirus, I am not. And believe it or not, I have not educated myself to the point to call myself an expert on that. I don't even call myself an expert on college football on this show. So you can bet your bottom dollar I'm not a disease expert. But I do feel good to wrap it up with where we are right now. Yeah, I do believe we'll start on time. I believe we'll have a few fans in the stands too. Last one here. This is recruiting. Chris, in the email inbox about an hour before the show, where do you think J.C. Latham will end up? J.C. Latham, for those of you unfamiliar, is a five-star offensive tackle. He is 6'6", about 305. He's at IMG Academy down in Bradenton, Florida, as are perennially many of the highest-rated players in America. To quickly walk you through the backstory, because there's been a lot of smoke within the last 24 to 48 hours that maybe things are changing, Ohio State has long been thought to be the leader here. And there were kind of whispers, when I was on vacation this last week, there were sort of whispers. I got a text or two about, hey, are you hearing stuff with J.C. Latham in Alabama? And all I ever do is text people who really know about recruiting. It's not like these kids are talking to me. Well, in most cases, they're not. I have talked to a few mothers over the past couple of weeks, nice people, but I'm not necessarily always the one with the scoop. But luckily, those people who do have it have their numbers securely stored in my phone here. Which reminds me, check out the Wiltfong Recruiting Whip Around on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel every week. the over-under for how many names he's going to put into that 10 to 15-minute video are like 100.5, and he normally hits the over. So I start asking around. Yeah, there was some smoke last week, especially late, and then I get back, and then lo and behold, last 48 to 24 hours, you've seen whether it be over on our Alabama site, BamaOnline.com, over on the Roundtable. I've seen updates, and it's VIP content. If you're not already subscribed, why in the world are you guys not subscribed? It's the most insane value in all of sports. So subscribe. You'll see what Tim Watts has posted over there. You'll see what Hank South has posted over there. The guys at Bucknuts, and I was on that side a lot today trying to get the temperature in the field. They've posted several updates. You are very rarely left in the dark with this stuff. Unless a kid just intentionally misleads everyone, very rarely with the network of experts we have here are you left in the dark. You're going to know what's going on. So with Latham right now, hey, I'm going to follow the tea leaves, and I'm going to say Alabama, but I'll also say this. What I found more interesting than just where I think he's going to go. And by the way, the feeling, the overall sentiment I gathered is if it's Alabama, it's sooner rather than later. So stay tuned on that one. I don't know anything. Like sometimes we've edited videos for kids, and I know, I'll never tell you, but sometimes I know, I don't know anything right now. So, but what I found interesting was I was over on our Bucknuts site, and I was looking, and I appreciate diehard fans, educated diehard fans, because as much as the casual observer is looking at Ohio State's recruiting class right now, and they're saying, oh man, Buckeyes by 10 miles this cycle, and hey, it may be. I'd certainly think they're the overwhelming favorite to finish with the top class. The difference between the casual observer and the informed observer can be found and measured pretty succinctly if you scroll up and down that Ohio State message board there, specifically on Bucknuts, and you look at how seriously those folks are taking the idea that they may lose J.C. Latham to Alabama. And their problem, whereas the casual observer would say, what's your problem? You're still going to have the number one class. Just as much as the casual observer sees it that way, Ohio State fans have the correct perception and the correct lens with which to look at these situations through. It's the one we've talked about on this show when we're talking about any of the elite teams. Ohio State knows they can out-recruit the Big Ten by 50 miles. And at the end of the process, it's still going to be nip and tuck, razor blade thin margins here and there at various position units between themselves and Alabama and Clemson and whoever else happens to be in the college football playoff. And they know. I saw a guy actually on the board say, you know, I can explain it no better than this. Imagine if we're playing Clemson in the Fiesta Bowl last year. They got a big lead. Clemson came back and won. What happens if Clemson has one less five-star offensive tackle? What happens if Chase Young gets a free release around the edge one more time and has one more chance to cause one more fumble or one more negative play? That could be the difference between us being eliminated in a heartbreaker versus us going on to play for and winning a national championship. That's how it works. That's how it works. You want to know why these folks take recruiting so seriously? That's it. If you're looking to go 8-5, if you're looking to win the division maybe, what they're doing is good enough. And what they're doing right now, if they're consistent about it, it's going to be good enough to eventually win a national championship. But the whole point is, good enough is not what these Tier 1 teams are looking for. They want to outpace everyone, and they want to consistently do it. And as much as you're looking at the kids they're going to get, I respect the heck out of those folks on the Bucknut site that are saying, and this is not over yet, but if they lose Latham perceptionally to Alabama, they look at it as, oh man, there's one more opportunity. If we got a razor-thin margin in a playoff game, there's one more opportunity where we could have a strip sack and a fumble when we're in the red zone, 17-17 mid-third quarter, that a five-star offensive tackle would not have allowed to happen. How can you not love college football? That's it for tonight. So remember, guys, we record the Late Kick Extra podcast on Tuesday. There is a pinned comment below every episode of Late Kick Live on YouTube. If you'll scroll down right now, you can see it. If you want to submit a question here, that's where to do it. Reply to that comment. You can also hit me in email, joshpate706@gmail.com. You can hit me on Twitter in my direct messages, or most preferably, and I think you can only do this on Apple right now, give us a 5-star review and give us a written review and put your question in that review. I guarantee you I get to every one of those. If we have to leave something out, we're certainly not trimming fat off of those submissions, because those mean a whole lot to us. Appreciate you watching. We'll be back here Thursday night, same time. For Colin, for Aaron, for Tanya, I'm Josh Pate. This has been Late Kick. Have a great week.